Recording.
Oh,
there we go.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, no
Sorry,
worries.
I should check.
I didn't want to record our general banter, but now that we're doing demos, let's get it recorded.
Yeah. Good call. Any pair? Yes, no? If no, then I'm just going to go down by number. 5. The pair that's working on a 5 issue.
I think that's
Would you like to do a demo?
Yes. Let me share my screen. We'll see how this works out. I always feel like I don't have enough space on my screen, so I set up a second screen. So this might just confuse me more.
Sometimes I would set up like a second desktop, and that's what I use for calls, so it's nice and clean. But other times I just do a whole reboot and clear everything off.
Yeah, I've cleared everything, but it's all the switching context on the small screen. Okay. I think I am screen sharing. Can you see?
Yes.
I think I'm just on the issue right now. Is that the right one? Great.
Yep.
So one thing we wanted to show to start off, so our issue was to allow a user to join an existing list. And the issue mentioned basically, that we could do it a couple ways. We decided that it would work best with our existing code to make it so that any list is associated with, like, any token is associated with a list in the database. So as soon as someone creates a list, generates a token, the list would be created in Firestore. So the first thing that we did to start is to kind of make some changes. So I'll kind of show the code first. Can you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
So we just made a little change to create list. We check if we've added an is token valid function that just basically goes into the database, checks to see if there already is a list with that token and returns true or false or throws an error. And we use that throughout in a bunch of different places. So it's very handy. We use it here to just make sure that the token isn't somehow already in the database. And then we add a list to the database, and in our home component, one that we have a little handle create list function that's tied to the button, and that basically calls the create list function that creates the list, saving the token and creating a list in the database. And then we handle pushing to basically redirecting to the list view. So I'm going to demo what that looks like. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is we changed the routing so that it's looking for everything that we're checking is the presence of a list ID, which is that list document ID that comes back from Firestore once a list has been saved into the database. So that way we ensure that on all the other views, like the add item form and the list view, that we definitely have a list ID, so nothing's going to break or do anything unexpected. So yeah, I will demo that, and I'm going to create a new list, and I'm sure we'll add a share feature. So right now I'm just going to go into my dev tools, and it is these are pretty great, sexy fjord yeast. And I'm going to send that over to Nick, who will join my list. Let's see. Can you see the token, Nick, or should I put it in the chat?
I can see it. We might want to also add a couple items here.
That's what I'm going to do right now.
Everyone can see.
So I'm going to add a couple of items. So here's my list. And I will switch mine off and it can take over.
Okay. So let me start my own screen sharing here. So we're back to our home component here, and we're going to join Anders list. I hope I remembered this correctly. I think I did. And here we are. So that is the basic functionality. Actually, what I just realized I forgot to do, which I will do really quickly here, is show the error handling when we try to join a list that doesn't exist yet. So let's get rid of this. Okay. So if the user enters a invalid token, we have this nice little error message here telling them that their token is not valid. So now I'm going to get into some of the code for that, what we've just shown you there. So we have this join list function. Is everyone seeing this? Okay. Okay. And we again use that is token valid check. And then if we do have that list, then we set our token to local storage and just return true. And if we don't have if we don't have a match on the list, we throw an error here. So we then pass down join list into our home component, and we use it in the event function, which we called handle join list. And this is just what actually fires on the submit event. So we have a couple of checks in here that I think Andrew's going to talk about in a second, going over some of the accessibility stuff we added. So this function basically just then calls join list with the share token, and then we again use the use history to redirect the user. And we have a couple of more, I actually think this is also something Andrew's going to go over with the accessibility, but we have, some specialized error handling for basically different possible scenarios of things that are can go wrong here. So I guess I will pass it over once again.
Yeah, one thing that we noticed that's interesting about Firestore is that we tested this after we did our first version. It's not immediately easy to tell the difference between something being not in the database, basically like if we were checking to see if the token was already in there. And we would get back an empty result if the token wasn't in the database, or if there was a connection problem and the internet went down for a second or anything else like that. So there is, let me share my screen just to show this really quickly. Yes. So in the code in app.js, you can all see that. We check in a couple places this query snapshot metadata from cache. And basically what Firestore will do is it will return cache data if you are not connected. So this is how you can tell, is this really the up-to-date result? Like there definitely are really no existing tokens like that in the database, or is this actually reading from a cache, in which case not what we want. And that was how we were able to do our error handling. So going back to home.js, we basically we did something, we put in 2 different kind of spaces for error messages. And the reason that we did that is for accessibility. And of course, like we could decide later on in the app to hide one of those if we thought it was redundant. But a really common pattern that we found when researching was that for screen readers, often there will be like an area that will summarize the problems with the form, especially for a longer form at the beginning, or say like you have 3 errors, and that will respond immediately after the form submitted to let the person like hear what happened. But then you also need to have something on each input that says, hey, there's something wrong with this one, and this is what it is, if the person is kind of clicking away. And then clicking back or trying to find where their errors are. So ours is pretty simple. So we could actually hide one of those, but it does help with a screen reader, which I will show. But yeah, basically all we do in here is we have the join list error that applies to the whole list. And then we have an error on this one token field. And we basically, you know, when someone is making a change or immediately after they submitted, we reset those errors. And then if there is something wrong, we can catch the errors from our join list function in our handle join list function here in home, and basically report back to the user based on basically what's going on. So we can say, oh, there's an invalid token, something's wrong with the field, or we can just say like, oh, well, this whole form, there's just a connection problem. And I will demo what that's like. And I'm going to try this. This worked for me earlier, so we will see. But I'm going to try my screen reader. So let me clear out my existing thing so that I can go back to that screen, my token. And I'm going to see if the Windows screen reader, can you hear this?
Running applications.
Great.
Select dial unknown.
Okay,
Type
so
toolbar.
I'm just gonna.
Main landmark. Create a new list button.
So
Title bar. Banner landmark heading level 1. Welcome to your smart shopping list.
I'm basically like going down through the things in the list.
Main landmark button. Create a new list. Or join an existing shopping list by entering a 3-word token.
So you can see that all the text will
Share
be read
token.
out. And now I'm gonna try to
Share
put in the
Edit
token.
required blank.
I'm gonna say wrong token,
N.
really wrong
O.
token.
Sorry, there was a problem with your token. Please try again or create a new list. Token is invalid.
So that first message will fire, basically, I use an alert, which I found, a role alert, which I found worked better than a live region, because it does seem to get read at the very beginning immediately, more than a live region does. I tried in a few different screen readers. And
Document.
here, this token is invalid. If I were to click
Smart shopping
away
list.
and then come
Main
back,
landmark. Share token. Edit required invalid entry. Token is invalid. Wrong token.
you can hear the message again.
But
So basically anyone trying to, you know, figure out what's wrong with that field as you navigate through the page, it's always associated with a message. Yeah, and that's pretty much what we did this week.
I'm really impressed. I think Andrew should do the learning module for accessibility.
I'm supposed to be doing I'm doing a hackathon this upcoming week with Pride Hacks, which is like a Canadian organization, works with all these LGBTQ nonprofits. And I'm doing basically an accessibility audit. I'm the team leader and project manager. So a lot of this stuff is new to me too. And I've just been like cramming and learning so much in the last week so that I can go and make this like major organization's terribly inaccessible website, like hopefully decent. So yeah, it's really interesting.
That's really great. If you're open to doing like a tech talk afterwards or something, I'm sure Andrew would be very happy to support you in that. And to schedule you in, but this is really great. Like this is way more than what the AC is asking for. So I want to say that's really good. And this is the part that I've seen the last cohort. People have stumbled a bit because one, the team did not need to really talk about the data structure of how to do Firebase. And then it doesn't inform how they're going to do this token creation thing. And then it comes back to the team and bite them like three, 4 issues down the line. So all of this is very forward thinking, very thorough. So I think it's really great work. Yeah, that's my feedback. Anybody else? Any questions?
I just wanted to also give a shout out to Nick and Ander for their ability to dig into documentation and look at documentation. The fact that you were able to determine what was causing you to get an empty array back based upon a blip in your Wi-Fi or actually not having a token is it was pretty impressive. So kudos on that as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I did not know about memory cache. That's really great.
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, I like the inline that you did with the errors versus like a pop-up modal. I know that was a group discussion. And so, you know, in this circumstance, in a form setting, I do think that it's a much more enjoyable experience from the user to not have a pop-up you have to close and so forth. So, you know, my personal preference, good choice.
Another little thing that we did, which is like a nice accessibility thing, is if you put in the wrong token, it also will focus you right back on that field.
Yeah.
So if you have a motor issue, or you know, you don't have as easy of time navigating the page, or if you just really don't want to have to click your mouse like all of us, it's, you know, a nice little touch to go to the full form field with an error.
Yeah, it's that's definitely important. And I know that when having gone back to retrofit things like that, it can get a little bit like, oh, come on, just put me in the field. So see, having that up front and just there is awesome. Good.
Sheila, Connie, do you have any questions, comments? No?
No questions from my side, but
Okay,
I agree, great job.
cool. Should we move on to the next pairs demo?
Yeah, sure. So I can share my screen. Um, So yeah, so our story was number 6, and it was to prevent a user from entering an item that is the same as an item that already exists in the database. And also one of our acceptance criteria was to make sure that we normalize for capitalization and punctuation, which we took to mean even if you enter you know, an item name with different capitalization or with punctuation in it, it would still consider that kind of to be an item that already exists in the database if it matches. So Sheila, you want to walk through kind of the UI functionality?
Sure. Mind if I share my screen?
No.
Okay. Hold on. All right. So can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, so I was kind of playing around with it before we started. But yeah, like let's say I have red apples, which is something I know that's already there. Then once I hit add item already exists in the shopping list. Also, since I already know I have red apple there, if I try to capitalize letters, it'll also feed back the same thing. Item is all already exists in the shopping list. We did try to play around with the space. So let's say if I type in accidentally made like 2 spaces and put Cheerios, then it would come over here. Hold on. it took Cheerios, it took the spaces off of Cheerios. One thing we've been working on is trying to, as you can see, I try to do pineapple with the spaces in between each letter, and it still let me add it. But that was something I think we were still trying to kind of work on and fix. And then also, hold on. If we try to put like honey with accidentally having letters or punctuation, it's still getting through. So it's still a couple of things we're trying to fix, but we're kind of narrowing down.
I think so when you add an item for the first time, we do remove the spaces. But we also do allow you to put punctuation and numbers if you want, and spaces as well. However, if you, Sheila, if you try to, if you try to enter pineapple a second time, that's where we're preventing that.
Right. And that's what I did try to do too. Like if I tried to put pineapple, I think I did do that. Just like with one altogether, it'll still automatically say the item is already on the shopping list.
Yeah, that was kind of a design decision that we made based off of looking at the Microsoft To Do app, which is personally one of my favorite apps. So we kind of went into that app and tried to see, okay, do they allow punctuation? Do they allow, spaces at the beginning? And they do allow punctuation and they allow spaces when you add an item. But if you do add leading spaces or trailing spaces, they do remove that, I assume, just to keep their back end clean, because I don't think you necessarily want leading or trailing spaces. So I can share my screen now and kind of walk through the code,
Okay.
how we achieve that. So share my screen. So we were mostly in the add item form component. So for us, we have on the item name field, we added onto this handle change function, the handle submit function actually in the overall form. So when you submit, we first check the database to get an array of list items from Firestore. So we're using this query shot that gets returned. And then we are creating an array of these items and then doing what's called a normalize. So it's a function that we wrote to convert everything to lowercase and remove all the non-word characters, which removes punctuation in all spaces. So that's just to create this array of items from the Firestore response. And then we take that array and check if it includes the item name that was just entered. And we also normalize that. So we do the same thing, all lowercase, and replace the non-word characters. If this array includes it, then we show that error message. Otherwise, we add the item to the database. But that's just, again, so you can add items with punctuation, with spaces the very first time. So you can do that, but when we're actually checking is where, it's removing the spaces and the and any punctuation with that normalized function. And if it already exists, then we show this error message. So again, that was kind of.
I think I forgot to show them jackfruit.
Yep, jackfruit's kind of an example. Oh yeah, and so yeah, this is the Microsoft To Do app, which we were kind of using as an example, as far as whether or not we want to allow spaces or not. Yeah, another example is if I add, and I don't know if I think jackfruit's in here. So I've added jackfruit with a space. So that's why we do allow spaces when you first add it. But if I were to come here and, try to add jackfruit without a space, you get the error. And again, this was a bit of a, we've thought a lot through all these different iterations, and we were like, okay, can we think of any foods or any items where, jackfruit is going to be different than jack space fruit? And we really couldn't think of anything. Peanut butter, ice cream, it means essentially semantically the same. So that's why we do prevent you from adding the same. I think that's the main thing. I think after this, we'd like to meet with Ander to kind of address all the accessibility issues and make sure the form is accessible as well. But we had a really good review process with our PR.
That's really great. I like what you've done and really thought about the spacing, and some of the design decisions are good. And the way that you model off of something else is also a good approach too. Sometimes issues, product managers, they would just give you simple ACs, and it's up to you to kind of decide how to implement it. So it's a good exercise in making those design decisions, and it works really great. One comment that as you were going through this, and I realized there was one thing I didn't catch is, so every time you do a check, you do a database call to get a list to check against. Am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's an area for optimization here for the future. In a sense, is that you already have a list view. So if that list is stored in your local state, you don't need to go to the database to fetch your list and check every single time, because of the way that the use collection hook on the list view, it gives you a snapshot. So whatever's changed in the back, you always get the updated thing. So if that one is saved to your local state, you can check against that, and that will save you a database request.
Even if it changes,
Mm-hmm.
there's the Firestore use collection hook.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a benefit of using that library, that hook library, is it's like it auto updates, and it's loading, and it's instant. So whatever you're changing, like let's say the rest of us are looking at the app through somewhere else, we can see the changes.
Okay.
Andrew?
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Andy,
I
did you have
noticed
something
that
else?
actually. And when I was doing the review, and I was like, not totally sure. That's one thing I was going to ask about. So what I was wondering is, should we maybe like in the next iteration move that like hook from list into like the app and then pass it down? Would that be, and it will just like update, and we won't have to worry about changes, because it does seem to update immediately in list. So, but I wasn't entirely sure, and I didn't have time to read everything.
Yeah.
But I noticed
Yeah, so this library, I think that's why it's recommended. And throughout each cohort, there's a little confusion of like, why are we using this library? What are we benefiting from? And I think it took me a little bit to wrap my head around. And there were some mentor discussions last cohort where it's like, why are we using this? And it's because it's that snapshot view of things updating so quickly that we benefit from. So this is a case where if you move it up to app level and you pass it to your child, then you don't need to refetch constantly. It's in your local state. But that's something that you could you could file an issue and then do a refactoring. This week is going to be a light week in terms of like the two tasks. There's one that is like really straightforward and easy. So then we're going to have a discussion about what are some things as a team you want to make better for the app that's not part of the stories. Then we want to empower you do that work this week if you want to. Yeah, this is really great, and just want to stress the fact that, like, you know, you met the AC, there are certain things you want to work on, that's fine. As an author, as a person who's creating a PR, this is a learning. I think it's a back and forth, is when to file these things and put it aside and go, oh, right, it makes more sense to create another PR to address those, because then it's not a blocker for you, it's not a blocker for other people, because potentially somebody else could be doing work to more of this, right? So the sooner you can finish out this PR, submit it, have the functionality in, you open it up for somebody else to work with it, and you can do another PR to kind of enhance it and build it better. So small PRs and things that you add to the code base. I want to make sure if I'm explaining that correctly.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, cool. Really great job.
I also wanted to say good job on this. I know we talked about it a bit during office hours, and it wasn't the easiest to get the ball rolling on in terms of getting momentum. So kudos to you both for doing that. One thing that I wanted to bring up for the whole team, and mentors, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I think you've created your first real helper function in this PR with the normalized input. And so something as a team that you might want to think about going forward is having a helper function file, so that anybody who needs to use it can pull from that file rather than having to go into another component to get it out or something to rewrite. So just something to think about.
Yeah, no, that's actually really great. And I want to point out that Nick actually started that discussion in the GitHub discussions panel. So I don't know if you guys are getting pinged on those or not. I did respond to him into that, just to say that it is good, not only for the reusability, but also for the visibility. As your app gets bigger and bigger, there's a lot of these helper functions that can be used elsewhere, but if they're not in a helper file, you don't always know they exist. So it's easier when they're separated out into a file that specifies these are helpers. And how you structure that obviously is going to depend on the overall structure of your code, whether you put it in individual components or you have just one big helper file. But yeah, I think it would be worth looking at some of your functions and seeing which ones are feasible to move into that kind of a structure.
Yeah.
But I wanted to point to, no, I just wanted to point back to the work that Sheila and Connie did. I know that you guys said that you allowed the individual, the user, to put in the punctuation and the things like that on first. That, in my opinion, actually meets the AC exactly, because it says that you should be putting the original input in the list the way it was given to you. So I know it feels weird to say, yeah, let them put these random things in there, but that was actually what the condition stated. So good job. Cameron, sorry.
Oh no, I was saying thanks for pointing that out, and good job, Nick, for being able to look forward and see that.
So I want to add, so for utilities and helper functions, a typical thing that I've seen in code bases is to have a utils folder where you can drop in individual files, or you can have one big file of helpers and you just export the functions that you need. That's potentially a good place. Like library is kind of similar, a similar sense, right? So you can add there, or you can add in or utils, whichever that you would like. And now I forgot what else I was going to say. Yeah, I forgot. Oh, it'll come back to me. But really good job overall. Like the team is just kicking ass, and I was really loving the discussions that are happening in the code reviews. I want to make sure that we get to the conversation about like what Anders asking about co-process and approvals and how to do it. And what does real teams do? And a lot of it depends. So we'll get to that at the end of this conversation, because I am curious to hear from Cameron and April in terms of like the different jobs they've had and how teams do code reviews, and how that cycle is. Yeah, I think that's all I have. If we want to move on to pair programming learning module.
Let me go ahead and share my screen. And All right. Condense you all into a smaller, there we go. So pair programming, and you guys I know have already been doing this for a few weeks now. So, you know, you've had a little bit of time to kind of get a sense of what it looks like, at least for you guys at the moment. So let's talk a little bit more about, why isn't that moving for me? Ah, there we go. What is pair programming? So essentially the idea behind it is that two developers work on the same code base using just one keyboard. So then the individuals will usually take on one of two roles, the driver or the navigator. The driver is the individual who's controlling the keyboard, and they're the ones doing the low-level thinking about the code, actually putting the code into place. The navigator pays close attention to what the driver is doing and will offer suggestions or ideas from more of a bird's eye view. So it's a little hard sometimes, especially if you're digging into something particularly technical or logic heavy based, to see both the close-up view of the code and what you're writing, and also the bigger picture of where that might trickle out and affect other parts of the code. So having individuals that have a responsibility for one side or the other of that is a really nice benefit of pair programming. So what that looks like in person, as you saw, is typically two people looking at one or two monitors and one keyboard at the base that they're working based off of. In pair programming remotely, it's a little bit different in that obviously we're remote. But there's also a lot of tools, and the nice thing about with everything happening from the pandemic is those tools are only getting better and growing and giving more and more opportunities. So it's kind of fun to see. But essentially, it's a very similar process in that two developers are going to hop on a call and share a screen. The driver is going to be the one sharing the screen and coding, while the navigator is providing feedback, asking questions. The driver is going to push the code remote to a remote repo so that the navigator can pull that code down locally. Sometimes you can do that like at the end. Sometimes you're going to do it in the middle so that they can maybe play around or research a certain area, or play around with, if does this break something, or you know, whatever the case is. And then at some point, you're usually going to be swapping roles, and then you start back at step one, where now you're just in a different role. Either if you're the driver, you're the navigator. If you're the navigator, become the driver. And it just rotates through that process. So, whoops. There's really kind of a mindset and an attitude around pair programming. Some people really, really like it. Some people don't like it very much at all. And most people that I've worked with like it in some circumstances, but would prefer not to do it on an 8-hour workday. So it just really kind of depends on yours. Essentially, it's, you know, as they put here, it's a lot like sharing your Legos. You know, you have to give and take and make compromises and, you know, kind of go with a flow that maybe isn't a direction that you might have gone with, but you want to still follow it through. And, you know, so if you approach pair programming from like a beginner's mindset and embrace that doubt and possibility of like, I don't know if that's going to work. If you're like the navigator, I encourage you to go with it. Let the driver take it and see where it goes, because you'll be surprised sometimes when at the end of it, you're like, oh, well, what do you know? That actually did work. And it's actually going to be a really efficient way to tackle that problem. It's also not necessarily about teaching and mentorship. It can be, and there can be those elements in there, but that's not really the purpose and the goal of pair programming. It's, you know, you want individuals to feel comfortable and not necessarily feel that they're being judged or in some way, you know, uncomfortable in the circumstances. So you really try to approach it more of a peer-based versus a mentor-based, unless it is specifically a mentor-based pairing. And then, as I said earlier, it's an opportunity to learn not only about the code and different ways that the code can be approached, but I can't tell you how many shortcuts and quick things and stuff that I've learned just simply by sharing a screen with someone else. And I'm like, whoa, wait, what kind of voodoo did you just do? And now I know a new, you know, shortcut or a new tool that I didn't know existed before, that was already in my editor and I wasn't utilizing. And now I can see in action and recognize ways that I can become more efficient And those are things that I probably would not have found had I not been in a pairing scenario. When you're a driver, you want to make sure that you get agreement before you proceed. So you don't want to just kind of pile through with your ideas and say, here's what we're doing. There's definitely a, hey, here's what I'm going to do. Let's do all of this. What do you think now that it's done? And there's a general consensus between the two coders that, yes, this is the right path and this is the code that we want to put forth. And then from the navigator's point of view, you'd like to approach it more from the asking versus the telling. So would it make more sense if we did this? Or what do you think if we decided to look over and do this, use this functionality? Or, you know, to put it more as a discussion and a question versus a, we need to use this, you know, telling. And that makes the experience more pleasant for everybody. So that's basically the main bulk of the presentation. There are some additional resources, and I'm going to share these slides with you all so that you'll have access to all of these links. But I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing just so that we can see all of your lovely faces and just kind of check in on how is pair programming going for you all, and does any of that look familiar, or are you feeling like, wait, maybe we, you know, have other ways that we should be approaching this? Or
I'll kind of start. I think it's going really well, and I think that at least most of my experience, it's been similar to that. Maybe not necessarily as formal with the pilot and co-pilot and handing it off. You know, sometimes I've had sessions with you all where we're both kind of working at the same time, or, you know, it's a little bit of a blend. You know, overall fairly similar to what you showed in that presentation. And I'll just say, I think one of the biggest benefits that I've seen for me is just actually talking out what you're doing, and so that you are forced to like understand it better than you would if you're just doing it on your own. I think that reflecting back on some personal projects I've done where I was just working on my own and ran into something difficult and, you know, figured out a solution, I don't know if every time I would be, you know, prepared if I put on the spot to like thoroughly explain everything that I did, right? So, you know, there are those things where you just like, you kind of find a way to make it work and you basically get what you did, but you know, you couldn't go line for line. So I think that it's been really helpful in forcing us to do that. And that's also just comes out in having the reviews and discussions about it as well. But
no, that's actually a really great point, and it does remind me that I did want to highlight that on the description of the driver, which is that the driver is intentional for the driver to verbalize what they're thinking rather than to just blindly type, not through the entire process, but through the majority of, you know, here's what I'm thinking, and I'm going to go, you know, do an ad, and, you know, so that the navigator also knows where you're going. Cameron.
I think that's a great skill to have as well for when you're interviewing. I've had multiple interviews where I'm programming in front of the interview panel, and it's one thing to be able to type your code, but it's a completely different skill set to be able to type and explain what you're typing and where you're going with it, so that they're able to follow it rather than having to decode what you're writing. And it's I'm sure I've missed out on jobs for that reason. So Yenli.
So another thing about this practice is that in a job interview, because you have to go through that, with this practice, you can pretend during that time that you are pairing with your peers or you're pairing with one of us. Then it kind of helps with your nerves, because like I'm going to normalize that I hate that part of the interview. It's like, I've never gone through and be like, yeah, I did great. It's always like, oh shit, but I'm going to just go through it anyway, right? So it's going to be hard. I'm saying it now. But this practice that you're doing with each other is one way of like the next time that you have to do an interview, you can think of it as like, oh, I'm pairing with my favorite person, and you want to approach it with that kind of mindset, then the interview process goes by easier, kind of tempers your nerve a bit.
Yeah, and I'm going to be forthright and normalize that my very first experience with pair programming was at my current position. And I didn't like it when I first did it because I felt very, very uncomfortable. I felt very, I actually jokingly with one of my reviews with my manager shared that I had seen a meme on Twitter that somebody put, and it was like me when I'm pair programming, and it's Mr. Bean trying to go down a staircase, and there's an older lady going very slow, and she keeps weaving so he can't get around her. And you know, basically the joke was that they were the old lady, and I'm like, that's exactly the way I felt in a pair programming because I was new to the code, and just all of it was a lot. And so it was. I wish that I had had more experience in more less pressured environments, not only for interviews, but also in those first weeks at my current position to feel a little less overwhelmed by it all. I now really enjoy it, and I'm very appreciative of the skill and being able to say, hey, let's hop on a call and go through this. I can't find what's happening here and could use your eyes.
Sheila, Connie, Ander, want to share your thoughts on pair programming?
I was gonna say it's definitely a learning curve for me, but like I can see the ways that it's super valuable. But yeah, it's so different. So it's like something I feel like over the weeks I'm adjusting and trying different ways and trying to find that balance. And it also ranges like from, you know, which person you're working on and what you're specifically working on, how much, you know, the kind of dynamic of like stepping back and then also like wanting to guide more, especially when there's like time constraints and everyone else has probably more strict jobs than me in terms of, you know, schedule flexibility. But yeah, it's been great. Like there are things like I think last week Nick reminded me that I actually have a React debugging tool installed in my browser that I totally forgot to install. I was like, oh yeah, how are you doing that? I haven't played with this for a while. So there are a lot of those. I do notice those little tips and things that we're kind of learning from each other. And I think it'll kind of get better as things go along too.
Yeah, I think it's been going really well. I enjoy it. It's kind of like I like thinking through it and working through it together. It's kind of that nice like lower pressure environment, right? Which is great. I was curious to the mentors, like how often in your current positions do you actually like pair program? Is that a very common thing, or are you mostly just developing on your own all day?
For me, it depends on what I'm working on. I know that I'm going to say probably on average about 5 hours a week that I would say that I'm pair programming, and it's mostly just you know, looking over something, or like right now we're getting ready to start a new project, and so it's going to have its own like folder structure and directory system. So Monday morning I'm going to be pairing with the person I'm working with on that, and we're going to make sure that we have it set up the way that we both want it, and then once that's set up we'll each go our own ways and come back whenever we need to. So yeah.
Plus one on that, so same thing. So I pair around like once or twice a week, depending on just where we are at in the project. So the last 2 epic work that I've started is been paired with the team lead, and it's for me to onboard into the code base. So the really great thing is we proactively in the very beginning, I think on our second epic, you know, we started the week going, okay, we gotta do this project, but you know, it was like we're both parents and we had like the sleep wasn't that great. So we're like, okay, we're just gonna pair today and see what we can do. And it's very ad hoc because just the structure of how our team works. So we paired and it just depends on our time together. So we spend about 2-3 hours. Sometimes it'll be a marathon pairing of like, we do 2 hours and I'm like, okay, I gotta do lunch. I'll meet you back and we'll continue. But through that process, like April said, you know, you structure out what you want to do. And in that discussion, it starts to make sense to the two of us how things can break up, how the different issues can break up easier. And then from there, for the rest of the week, it's like maybe we'll pair again another day, but there will be days where we have a lot of meetings or time because of time zone it doesn't match up. And that's where it's like, okay, it makes sense for me to work on these while my lead is going to work on these, and then we touch base. And then anytime that I like, let's say sorting, it's really hard to do, especially when it's a deeply nested JSON object, right? So I started on the sorting stuff and I got stuck and I just ping in the Slack channel like, okay, I need another set of eyes. This is another thing to think about too when you're pairing, is to think it in terms of supporting each other and having that second pair of eyes, because it seems slow and it seems uncomfortable, but 2-3 hours later, or when you finish a task, it's very common that I feel with my team lead is like, oh, that was easier than we thought. Like, okay, so I think we're done. Like, I thought we would be like banging our heads on this for another day or two, but no, we finished it. So a lot of it is depending on who you're working with, how open they're to it. Cameron.
Excuse me. In my current position, almost never, and I really miss it. Not only because it helps you just catch bugs before they become bugs, but it's, especially working remote, scheduling time to work on a common goal really builds team I don't know, unity. Or my position before this one, it actually was a lot in the beginning. I'd say it's probably half of the week I was doing pair programming when I was onboarding and starting. As I got further along, it got less, probably around 5 hours a week or so. But it also depended on, it was a small startup, so it depended on how busy everybody was trying to get a new feature to continue our runway. So it really does depend on what kind of company you're in and their ability.
I know there was a period of time right before I started with my company where they were trying to encourage that people would set aside a certain number of hours per day to pair program, and that got abandoned within a few months because it started to feel too formalized and not as productive as it is when you do it a little bit more spontaneously and on an as needed basis. But I do know there are companies, because we have somebody, my team tech lead for my team came from a company that they pair program 8 hours. They are on pair programming all day. They take an hour lunch break and they come back and they pair program again. And so that to me is exhausting. I like people and I like my team, but wow, that's a lot.
So same. So I think it's Pivotal Labs. They're
Yes,
bought
it
by
is.
somebody else right now. Yeah, Pivotal Labs.
Yep,
It's
Pivotal.
like a all day, every day. You know, I'm an introvert. I need my time. So that is a lot. But I also want to put it out there, like, if you're pairing with someone who you perceive to be a lead, like, try not to be intimidated, because they're also human. And one of the most powerful things that you get experience when you're pairing with a lead is they're stumbling over the same things you are. They're having a hard time typing the same misspelling over and over again. So that's what's so great about pair programming, is recognizing, like, seeing the human in the other person. And you know, you may think that you're wasting your lead's time, but your lead is going to tell you that, oh my God, I'm so like happy that you pair with me, because you know, they're forced to slow down and answer your questions or verbalize things that maybe if they're pairing by themselves or they're coding by themselves, they're going to make some assumptions and it just piles on, and it may not be the best decision in terms of building things. Sheila, any thoughts you'd like to share? I want to make sure I make space for everybody to speak.
Well, I think for me, because I feel like when I'm coding with anybody, they're usually the lead. Because I feel like I just kind of put myself in a position of ready to learn from everyone. So that's just been kind of my take. Like I've learned so much just coding with like Nick and Ander and Connie that like it's just been a lot to take in, but it was a lot to learn. But I'm glad I learned those things.
That's great. I mean, that's actually, I mean, it's really, really great. And it's totally fine. Like I said, in the very beginning, I was way more comfortable as the navigator than the driver. I would encourage, as the weeks go on, that you step into that driver role at least once to experience it, but also you might surprise yourself. In fact, you probably will surprise yourself.
I was just going to say that my experience working with Sheila, which was like, I think our first pair programming week too, like she is just back looking at all the documentation, reading through everything, like absorbing it all. Like she's kind of like the documentation person, and like so great at that. Like I definitely feel like I got a lot out of that, and that you're, you know, thinking like 10 steps ahead while I'm just like type, okay, do this. So yeah, definitely contribute a lot. You're very observant, and you pick up and like notice things and remember them that I just like speed right over.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to have that feedback. Cause I feel say like with Connie and Nick too, it's like like when we came to the problem of let's say like trying to figure out how to get rid of the spaces or the punctuation and stuff like that. I was just constantly, I mean, we both were, but I was just like researching and like, oh, wait a minute, let's try this.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was kind of, and even like, I don't know, sometimes like when we'll get off the computer and it's still like, and we're still stuck at something, I'll be up for like 1 or 2 still trying to research and figure out the problem. But that's just me. I don't know why.
Same. My husband's always like, you're always on your computer. I have a problem in my head and I can't move on until I solve it.
That's me.
Yeah. Sometimes doing something else or you know, letting it process, they'll come to you. I've walked away cooking dinner and I come running back to their laptop and message my teammate like, hey, did you think of this? But really, I have to go now.
Chicken's burning.
Yeah. But that's really great. I'm seeing the fruits of your work, the way you are all working together. It's just been amazing.
Yeah, it's been really, really fun to just kind of watch everything slowly like growing.
Should we move on to issues?
I think we're ready.
We went a little over, yeah.
And I was just thinking like maybe we should schedule these for 1.5 hours because I feel like it's always a little tight for us to get in just that 1 hour, but
I know
we can discuss that, I guess.
I think we're supposed to keep it to 1 hour.
Dang it.
Just to not overtake everybody's schedule, but yeah.
Are you able to see my screen here?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so this is issue 7. As a user, I want to see a welcoming prompt to add my first item if my list is empty to help me get oriented to how the app works. So the acceptance criteria, the list view, when there are no items to display, should show a prompt, a button for the user to add their first item. This is the wireframe. Well, if it loads, there we go. So if there are no items in your shopping list, you should get a prompt saying your list is empty or something to that effect, and a button to add item This note is going to be pretty important. These are navigation tabs, not buttons. So these will not satisfy the acceptance criteria. So this is one of the lighter ones this week, I believe. So you might have another chance to tackle some issues that are on the list that you've added as you've built. So just keep that in mind. And then number 8, as a user, I want to mark an item on my shopping list as purchased so the app can learn how often I buy different items. Actually, you know what? I'm sorry. Does anybody have questions about 7? I jumped over that. While we're here, we could go there. I'm gonna take silence as no question.
Is there like a particular thing that the button, is it kind of just like directs you to the other page with the form basically, or is it kind of open how to do that, or?
So I'm not actually sure. I think it's pretty open, but I don't know that it should be necessarily just like a routing situation.
Yeah.
The fact that they've differentiated, these are navigation tabs, not buttons, makes me think that it might be something other than just a reroute to the ad page. Yenli, did you have something to add?
I think it is a reroute to the ad page.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for this page, they just want the if the list is empty to be something there to let people know that it's purposefully empty and not just a blank page, because it's
Okay.
a confusing UI. So this is pretty straightforward. And if you say to add item, it just redirects you to the add item component.
Thank you.
Or the URL, yeah.
Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna jump to number 8. As a user, I want to mark an item on my shopping list as purchased so the app can learn how often I buy different items. The acceptance criteria is a user is able to tap a checkbox or similar UI element to mark an item in the list as purchased. An item should be shown as checked for 24 hours after the purchase is made. We assume the user does not need to buy the item again for at least 1 day. One challenge your parent might work through is figuring out how you will test this. And I guess a tip is to maybe create a few sample items in the Firestore console and then manipulate the dates so that you can interact with it on your branch. Here is the wireframe. I think we are ignoring the details and delete for this issue. And so we're just trying to get our list with checkboxes that can be clicked and have that update in the database. And then in 24 hours, that checkmark should be gone again. Do we have any questions on that one?
So for the checkboxes, are these, I noticed the colors on them here. So that corresponds to the frequency?
You know, they might. I'm not actually sure, but in reading the acceptance criteria, I don't think we need to have it correlate with the frequency in which they are bought. It may also just be easier to see which line is checked, that they're separate colors.
Okay.
So I want to add that those colors are for a later issue and not part of this issue. I don't remember exactly which issue, but it's for later.
Okay.
And I think one other thing that it may trip people up a little bit is so the acceptance criteria where like it's recommended to assume that a user will not check in again in 24 hours. The reason for that is to make this app simpler, because if you want to implement the uncheck, it complicates the functionality a bit much. So it's not to say not to do it as a team. As a team, if you want to do that, it's okay, but it should be a separate issue to think about, because it does get really complicated as you move on to the next steps. Because if you uncheck it and you check it, like how many times would you let that happen? How many times do you, update your database and such?
This week, the pairs are going to be Ander and Sheila, and then Nick and Connie. And does either pair have a preference for which issue they tackle?
I kind of feel like number 8 might be fun.
Okay.
If you're down with that, Sheila.
I'm down.
Sounds like it's good then. Nick and Connie, you have number 7. And I would suggest chatting with each other, I guess, and the others, and deciding if you want to tackle some of the other issues that have been added to the list, or some backlog of things you wanted to complete during other issues, and doing a reasonable amount. Don't try to tackle all of them if it takes too long.
It is a good exercise to, when you tackle an issue, to think about, to make your PR small, so that when you go through the cycle, the review cycle will be quick. I think this is a good lead into the conversation I want to have about process. So I'm going to share my screen real quick, and just so we have the engineering cadence thing up to reference to talk about. So here is our weekly cadence, right? So this is recommended approach from TCL. It's not exactly what you would get in a real workplace, and there is a reason for it. So here, for recommended thing is, we want to give you the 3 days to work on your story and then review other people's PR. So the way that this is visually put out, it seems like you don't review the other pair's work until you finish your work. And this is the part where I would say, no, the real world case scenario is it's never perfectly like that, right? So sometimes I think the mindset to go into it is to think about, you don't want to be a blocker for somebody else, right? Like, they need your review, and potentially they need to merge it, and it needs to deploy. So the practice of knowing how to stash what you're currently working on, and then switch to another branch to code review real quick, so that you can unblock your teammate and help them get to the finish line, is the mindset to have. So you don't have to wait till your work is done to review theirs, because potentially your work can be, you could be working on a big feature things, and the other person is just working on a small thing. But if they're waiting for you to be done, then there's too many blockers in that way. So at TCL, we want you to practice reading code and reviewing other people's code, and gain that confidence of being a part of the conversation. So we're going to do a learning module on communication for devs, and right now you can see that there's a lot of communication that happens, a lot of context switching. There's many different places that you can talk about the same issues, so how to manage that it's another skill. So we really encourage you to review other people's PR. And for us mentors, you only need one approval to merge your things. Let me stop here and make sure if I'm answering your question, Ander, or giving everybody else a sense of how the process is for TCL.
Yeah, I think mostly. I feel like I get in situations during the kind of review process, like let's say once whatever I'm working on that week is basically like the PR has been submitted for review, then sometimes I'll notice something or someone else will point something out. And yeah, so basically it sounds like what you're saying, because I was thinking before, well, if I'm changing this after 4 people have reviewed it because of something that somebody noticed or something that we came up with later, then like how much review needs to happen again and again and again. So it sounds like what you're saying is basically like anything that's like a change, if like one other person probably puts eyes on it, like ideally that's a good thing to do before merging into main. And then it's going to kind of like vary, you know, because I also don't want to be creating like a whole bunch of issues for things that are small and related to what we're working on, but want to have the balance of keeping the PRs also like small and manageable. So it's that kind of question. I'll be like, well, should I do an issue, or can I just like stick this in since it's a little quick thing? I don't want to annoy people basically. Like I don't want to be like, oh, now I have to go through all of this again because of this change, or to be like, oh, now there's like a whole issue and that took a whole bunch of work to have everyone look at. So I'm trying to do the best thing for everyone's time.
I have something to say to that, but I'll let April go first.
I was going to say in regards to like if you're making changes after it's already kind of gone through the review process, I know for me at my work, you know, the ultimate onus comes down to the author of the MR. And so, oh, sorry, we do get that, the PR. And so if you feel like the change that you've made has been thoroughly tested by you, or it was very small and significant, and you're comfortable and confident with pushing that through without requesting an additional review, then that trust is given to you to make that judgment. If you did in fact add some additional, like I had a circumstance where I had written tests and I'd written them in one format, and then after pairing with my tech lead, we changed it into a table test. So the tests were similar, but they were different. And so I just made sure to tag the reviewers that had already approved it to say, FYI, I did make some changes. If you'd like to re-review, please feel welcome. But I also knew that I had enough eyes from other individuals on those changes that I didn't need them to come back in, but I wanted to give them that option. So that's kind of one way that I tackle those moments.
Just like responding directly to that. Yeah, that's what I was going to ask is should I tag people in this? Just like, oh, can you just take a look at this? So that sounds like that would be a good thing to do then. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think one way to look at PRs. So I think one thing that I want to verbalize and make sure and put it out there, the mindset about PRs. The PR is for the author, right? This is to give context to somebody else, but it's not like, oh, I'm approval is not it's not a test, right? It's for you to make sure, so you have confidence that what you're merging in there is not going to break. So in my past job situation where in terms of merge conflicts, it wasn't like, oh, you have to ask another person. But for me to be confident about that merge conflict, then I would ask another person. I would pull in another person. And as a code reviewer, when someone pings you and go, hey, can you review this? It's a way of saying, hey, can you help me? So if you look at PRs as how to support each other to merge in high quality code is a way to look at it. It's not to say, oh, you're doing a bad job. You know, if you get stuff like that, that is a sign of a toxic workplace, right? So just want to put it out there. So a lot of times, the way I approach my work in terms of merge conflicts is that part of my workflow when I'm working in a branch, when I want to keep my focus, I keep working on my branch, but I pop my head out and pay attention to what happens on main. I pay attention to what other people are merging, because at the same time, you need to make sure that the code that you're working on is up-to-date code. You don't want to build your feature based on old code, then there's a higher chance of merge conflicts. So part of my work process and how I do things is I anticipate merge conflicts by paying attention, so getting the context of what other people are working on, being really good and responsive about co-reviewing other people's things. So I know that when I hit a merge conflict, I know how to merge it and make the executive decision on their features, like, oh, I know what they're trying to do. And then what I'm trying to do, it goes with that. So I proactively pull in main, especially if I'm working on a feature branch that is long building. I would pull from main, merge it into my code, get the latest, see how my code is, resolve the conflicts, and then keep going. So by the time that I put my PR in front of somebody, it is at sync to the main branch. So that's one
Great.
workflow thing that I do for me. Cameron?
I agree with that, Yenli, and that workflow. I also want to point out that this week, whatever I've done have been in 2-week sprints. So I've had a bit more time and it hasn't been so condensed, the PR review portion of it. So it is difficult for what you all are doing right now because it's a pretty condensed portion. But I do want to point out that what Yenli is saying, I absolutely echo, is that you should be keeping a little bit of an eye on main and what other people are up to. And I think that's the point of daily stand-ups or every other day stand-ups, is to help with that. But then before you create your PR, you pull in main, deal with as many, if there are merge conflicts, as many merge conflicts as you can. And that is how you avoid that going forward. But I also, I lost my train of thought. It was right there. I might have to circle back to it. But yeah, I'll leave it at that for now.
I wanted to add, I for my own circumstance, we have 10 separate teams that all work on our code base. And so like when I hear keep an eye on what's happening on main, I'm like, oh no, I can't do that. That's too much work going up at any given day. But I do what Yenli said, which is that I do make sure that I am continually merging those changes into my branch. And that way I have a better chance of catching a conflict when it's just a small conflict and before I've continued to build onto that conflict and made it more complicated. So I most days will either start my day, if I'm going back to my branch, by pulling in our main branch and making sure that I'm up to date with it, or at the very least, I'll do it every other day, just to make sure that I'm on top of all those changes. Because if somebody's been working on something and it isn't a big change, they might not have alerted to our team that it's in our code section because it wasn't big, but it does impact what I did. So if I can catch it early, it keeps that much more condensed. Cameron.
I remembered what I was going to say. Andrew, I believe your question was, if I get feedback and I want to make these changes and they're small, my litmus test was always, if the changes I'm going to make affect somebody else's branch or PR or something, then I request a review, or I give them a heads up like, hey, I did this. If you have time to review this, that'd be great. If it's siloed in mine and I was confident and I tested it thoroughly, I may leave a note on my PR that says, I updated this just for a record of it, in case somebody goes back and says, this isn't what I reviewed. They can see what you've done after they reviewed it, and then move forward in whichever manner you feel comfortable moving forward. And then Yenli?
Yeah, so one thing I want to also say is read the room. So when you join a team, a lot of times I definitely recommend, like, a lot of these process, and I say depends, is it depends on your team, how it runs, right? Like some teams are Agile Scrum every 2-week sprint. My current team right now is a Kanban, check in whenever you can, do whenever you can, release whenever you can. And we are a small team. So then in that case, how does the team do it? And then so that is the case where when you start, these are the questions you would ask. And also to understand, to understand how your teammates work is also another good question to have these one-on-ones, find out how they work. One thing I did learn from my last cohort, whereas in like when there's a merge conflicts, is I never knew that you had to ask for another review. But the lead mentor last session was like, hey, who says you can commit? You need like approval. And I was like, whoa, wow. So based on his team room, that's how they process, right? If there is a merge conflict, you have to ask for approval because it could break things. So those kind of things can range depending on the team that you're part of. But a lot of times, again, it's more of what you need so that when you know you merge your code, that you're not going to break anything. Nick?
So this is just a quick question for when we're talking about this experience going forward. Is our development process in this project now, would it be considered an agile process or similar?
I think it's
Yeah,
Agile Scrum.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think that's a thing you get in job descriptions and interviews is, are you familiar with Agile workflow?
Yeah, I think some
Yeah.
places like to know that you already have a sense and a feel for what that rhythm looks like.
Yeah, so you're getting the really close rhythm for that, because I think Scrum has a very definite code freeze, code review type timeframes, which is what we have here. And then just how you cycle through the review process, it's similar. But I do recommend reviewing the other pairs work as soon as you can. So when they merge, you can merge, and then you get I've seen teams get everything done by like Thursday and they're already merged by Friday. So just putting it out there, but no pressure though. You can also take your time too, because I do know there are some tasks that are meatier. And one thing that I also want to point out, we're structured in this way. In the very beginning, we want you to have our reviews, because in the beginning it's very overwhelming, and you gain, it's a good experience to get feedback from everybody. I think that's also the missed opportunity. If you don't review somebody else's, you're missing out on that. And getting feedback, I think, is the hardest thing too. There are many times at a job where you send out a PR and it doesn't get reviewed. And that's really hard. And we want you to experience that, the review cycle as much as you can here. And then know how to navigate that when you're at a new job where they may not be as on top of it. And what are some things you can do to get more feedback?
I also, in regards to the Agile Scrum process, just know that there's a lot of variation in that world. And I know for us, like I say, we have 10 distinct teams within our platform team. And each of those has the freedom and flexibility to set whatever cycle and cadence they feel is good for them. And so our current team, we have a bit more of a hybrid where it is set up on 2-week sprints, and we follow some of the Scrum processes, but we also work off of a Kanban style workboard. So it's kind of a little bit of both. And so in our circumstance, I set aside about a minimum of an hour every day to check the board, or to check our open work and see if there's anything that needs my review. And then I go in and we'll normally tag each other. So oftentimes I'll already know what I'm going to go in, and I'll have a list in front of me of priority, and we usually try to do first in, first out. But sometimes, some kind of a priority instance will push one up above the other. But yeah, so I spend at least an hour each day checking the board and reviewing my teammates' work, in addition to then working on my own.
Mm-hmm. Did that help? Any more questions about process or workflows or how we work? Great. I'm hosting office hours this week, so I'll throw up something on Slack. And I don't have anything else. Does anybody have anything else they want to talk about?
Nope, I'll put up a link to the slides, and then I'll have the video from this call and add that to the pinned. So if you ever need to go back and look at it, there is a pinned comment, and I just add each week to it. So you can find it that way.
Cool. Well, happy rest of Sunday, everybody.
Thank you all.
See you guys.